Good. Okay.
Now we're good.
Sorry, I'm trying to deal with a cat, so I was on mute.
Yeah, part of the fall, hey, Sam.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we look at this issue here, what problems did Darwin have that would lead people like Attenborough to go with him so strongly? Remember where Diane started? I mean, David Attenborough launches his archive project dealing with animals and the whole situation. And when you look at his comments that we quoted to start with, 2003, about did God create a worm that can only live in no other way than an innocent child's eyeball? Remember the comment? It's simple. The worm doesn't live in the eyeball, it dies. And then your eyeball surrounds it with a calcium deposit to stop the infection from the rotting tissue getting into your body. God had a backup even for worms that somehow would get into your eye. And please don't think it's aiming for your eye. David, listen carefully. We've said it to you before. We'll say it again. These worms, where they end up, depends on where the fly bites you on the body. Does it bite you on the head? Does it bite you on the leg? Lots of diseases come, and they're all different, but caused by the worm, the same worm in a different position. But going one step further, Nature did an interview with David Attenborough, and this applies to Bill Nye, it applies to so many people. Why is teaching evolution now more important than ever? Pretty picture on the book, pretty nice, lovely, child-friendly frog there. Why is teaching evolution more important? Because of the influence of the Bible's book of Genesis. Do you realize they know exactly what this is about? The Bible's book of Genesis, treated in authority, does not say that. If you're trying to resolve that picture, like the theistic evolutionist, millions of years of death and struggle gave rise to a creation that God calls very good. David Attenborough can't do it. Bill Nye can't do it. And you're wasting your time trying to do it because it simply won't work. David Attenborough says we've got to get rid of this. God created the world a very good place. And then it moves on. By the end of chapter 1, you have man made in God's image. God's image, a reflection of God. He's like God. He may not be God, but God is very good. So man is very good. That's your starting point. Do you believe that? Because David Attenborough knows what it means. Charles Darwin knew what it meant. Can you now spot Charles Darwin's problem? Why do we put it that way? Because he wrote this book. I mean, that's what he's famous for. Oh, you don't normally see that huge title on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races. You didn't need to read the book. But you see, what most people don't appreciate is that Charles Darwin had a prejudice, a bias, something he's not going to tell you. In fact, can I encourage you, if you are dealing with aggressive people who are attacking you at church, at university, whatever, listen for what they're not saying. The origin of species. Charles Darwin trained as a theologian. Why didn't he write on the origin of kinds, on the origin of the groups mentioned in Genesis? Well, he picked species because he knew the Bible didn't speak about species. In the struggle for life, he knew the Bible didn't speak about struggle for life in the beginning. Here was his struggle after his favorite daughter, Annie, died. Oh, this is from his great-great-grandson, right? Written in the review that was leading up to Charles's final, celebration of the faith's 200 years or so after, 150 years after his book came out. After Annie's death, Charles Darwin set the Christian faith firmly behind him. A friend died, a daughter died, and now he says Christianity can't be true. Freed from the last vestige of belief that the world was perfect because God created it that way, God continued without spiritual restraint. Darwin continued without spiritual restraint to work out his theory on the origin of species. In other words, he had a personal problem. Somebody died. If he wanted to fit it in the picture of things, he could not fit it in Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2. He didn't want to go to Genesis chapter 3. So our recommendation is that Darwin's book on the origin of the species should really be retitled that, My Revenge. Now, can I encourage you, in Victoriana, Queen Victoria's morally astute, upright England, can you spot problems in what Charles Darwin would have heard in the churches? All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, dinosaurs, lions, tigers, the purple-headed mountains, the snowy-covered hills. What? The snowy-covered hills weren't there in the book of Genesis. There's no snow until the book of Job. You see, the Victorian church was firmly committed to onward, upwards, England forever. And yet the Bible they should have been hearing about in churches is that. Charles Darwin at Theological College should have been hearing about that. But he was hearing about all things bright and beautiful. Man sinned. God cursed the ground. Death entered the planet. And the world's history, from good to bad. You see, if you leave out from the history of England, from the history of Rome, from the history of the world, that little four-letter word, which the theologians, particularly around the time of the Reformation, rediscovered the blessing of how God dealt with that issue, not how Darwin would have dealt with it, not how the Catholic prelates would have dealt with it, but how Jesus dealt with it. You see, God created the world perfect. He gave man all the rules, and yet man, using his will, chose to sin. And God had already prepared a way out. Oh, not Noah's flood. Noah's flood would just kill off many of the creatures. Yep, many of the creatures were killed. Didn't necessarily die out in Noah's flood because 2 of every air-breathing creature got on board. Hey, that's a we're getting rid of the whole program on that, Diane. But you see, there's the point. The world changed from good to bad to worse. Have you got that? That is the real history of the planet. It's from a created perfection. Whoops, we went one step too far. There. Oops, it comes that's black. I don't understand that. But anyway, we'll keep that there and then try and figure out what happened to the next one. The world changed from good to bad to worse. Let's see if it's hiding in here somewhere. No, it isn't. It's on our screen. Yes, there we are. This is degeneration or devolution. You catch those words? Now, old, Richard David Attenborough and all of his friends don't like the concept of devolution. Some of the worst skeptics that I've debated don't really want John Mackay talking about devolution, because devolution is all you got, folks. The pine trees becoming worse, the vegetables becoming worse, unless you kick in a little bit of entropy there and add your brains and then leave them alone, and they'll go backwards. Yes, the world is changing, the world is degenerating. But question, in that whole picture, it'll be the last section I deal with, but we're going to take another question opportunity here. On that whole line from Adam to sin to Noah to Babel to nations and tribes, all the way down to us with our current list of diseases, environmental problems, can you think of where disease is first mentioned? I mean, we said this is really about, do you actually believe the scripture? And reality, there's the picture, just following through from chapter to chapter. But have you ever gone looking for when the first person ever got sick? It wasn't Noah. Noah didn't die of sickness. Did Adam ever have a cold? No record mentioned of that.